Repetition is not generality. Repetition and generality must be distinguished in several ways. Every formula which implies their confusion is regrettable. For example, when we say that two things are as alike as two drops of water, or when we identify there is only a science of the general, with there is only a science of that which is repeated. Repetition and resemblance are different in kind, extremely so. Generality presents two major orders, the qualitative order of resemblances and the quantitative order of equivalences. Cycles and equalities are their respective symbols, but in any case, generality expresses a point of view according to which one term may be exchanged or substituted for another. The exchange or substitution of particulars defines our contact in relation to generality. That is why the empiricists are not wrong to present general ideas as particular ideas in themselves, so long as they add the belief that each of these can be replaced by any other particular idea, which resembles it in relation to a given word. By contrast, we can see that repetition is a necessary and justified conduct only in relation to that which cannot be replaced. Repetition as a conduct and as a point of view concerns non-exchangeable and non-substitutable singularities. Reflections, echoes, doubles, and souls do not belong to the domain of resemblance or equivalence. And it is no more possible to exchange one's soul than it is to substitute real twins for one another. If exchange is the criterion of generality, theft and gift are those of repetition. There is therefore an economic difference between the two. To repeat is to behave in a certain manner, but in relation to something unique or singular which has no equal or equivalent. And perhaps this repetition at the level of external conduct echoes for its own part a more secret vibration which animates it, a more profound internal repetition within the singular. This is the apparent paradox of festivals. They repeat, and unrepeatable. They do not add a second and third time to the first, but carry the first time to the nth power. With respect to this power, repetition interiorizes and therefore reverses itself. As Pigouille says, it is not Federation Day which commemorates or represents the fall of the Bastille, which celebrates and repeats in advance all the Federation days, or Manet's first water lily, which repeats all the others. Generality, as generality of the particular, thus stands opposed to repetition as universality of the singular. The repetition of a work of art is like a singularity without concept, and it is not by chance that a poem must be learned by heart. The head is the organ of exchange, but the heart is the amorous organ of repetition. It is true that repetition also concerns the head, but precisely because it is its terror or paradox. These Severn rightly distinguished two languages, the language of science, dominated by the symbol of equality in which each term may be replaced by others, and lyrical language in which every term is irreplaceable and can only be repeated. Repetition can always be represented as extreme resemblance or perfect equivalence. But the fact that one can pass by degrees from one thing to another does not prevent their being different in kind. On the other hand, generality belongs to the order of laws. However, law determines only the resemblance of the subjects ruled by it, along with their equivalence to terms which it designates. Far from grounding repetition, law shows rather how repetition would remain impossible for pure subjects of law, particulars. It condemns them to change. As an empty form of difference, an invariable form of variation, a law compels its subjects to illustrate it only at the cost of their own change. No doubt there are as many constants as variables among the terms designated by laws, and as many permanences as perseverations as there are fluxes and variations in nature. However, a perseveration is still not a repetition. The constants of one law are in turn variables of a more general law. Just as the hardest rocks become soft and fluid matter on the geological scale of millions of years, so at each level it is in relation to large, permanent natural objects that the subject of a law experiences his own powerlessness to repeat, and discovers that this powerlessness is already contained in the object, reflected in the permanent object wherein it sees itself condemned. Law unites the change of the water and the permanence of the river. This is the meaning of the grove, the grotto, and the sacred object. Saint Preux learns that he cannot repeat only because of his own change and that of Julie, but also because of the great natural permanences, which assume a symbolic value and exclude him no less than true repetition. If repetition is possible, it is due to miracle rather than to law. It is against the law, against the similar form and the equivalent content of law. If repetition can be found even in nature, it is in the name of a power which affirms itself against the law, which works underneath laws, perhaps superior to laws. If repetition exists, it expresses at once a singularity opposed to the general, a universality opposed to the particular, a distinctive opposed to the ordinary, an instantaneity opposed to variation, and an eternity opposed to permanence. In every respect, repetition is a transgression. It puts law into question. It denounces its nominal or general character in favor of a more profound and more artistic reality. From the point of view of scientific experiment, it seems difficult to deny a relationship between repetition and law. However, we must ask, under what conditions experimentation ensures repetition? Natural phenomena are produced in a free state, where any inference is possible among the vast cycles of resemblance. In this sense, everything reacts on everything else, and everything resembles everything else, resemblance of the diverse with itself. However, experimentation constitutes relatively closed environments, in which phenomena are defined in terms of a small number of chosen factors, a minimum of 2, for example, space and time, for the movement of bodies in a vacuum. Consequently, there is no reason to question the application of mathematics to physics. Physics is already mathematical, since the closed environments, or chosen factors, also constitute systems of geometrical coordinates. In these conditions, phenomena necessarily appear as equal to a certain quantitative relation between the chosen factors. Experimentation is thus a matter of substituting one order of generality for another, an order of equality for an order of resemblance. Resemblances are unpacked in order to discover an equality which allows the identification of a phenomenon under the particular conditions of the experiment. Repetition appears here only in the passage from one order of generality to another, emerging with the help of or on the occasion of this passage. It is as if repetition momentarily appeared between or underneath the two generalities. Here too, however, there is a risk of mistaking a difference in kind for a difference of degree, for generality only represents and presupposes a hypothetical repetition, given the same circumstances then. This formula says that in certain situations, one will always be able to select and retain the same factors, which represent the being equal of the phenomena. This, however, does not account for what gives rise to repetition, nor for what is categorical or important for repetition in principle. What is important in principle is n times as the power of a single time without the need to pass through a second or a third time. In its essence, repetition refers to a singular power, which differs in kind from generality, even when, in order to appear, it takes advantage of the artificial passage from one order of generality to another. Expecting repetition from the law of nature is the Stoic error. The wise must be converted into the virtuous. The dream of finding a law which would make repetition possible passes over to the moral sphere. This is always a task to recommence, a fidelity to be revived within a daily life, indistinguishable from the reaffirmation of duty. Conscience suffers from the following ambiguity. It can be conceived only by supposing the moral law to be external, superior, and indifferent to the natural law. But the application of the moral law can be conceived only by restoring to conscience itself the image and the model of the law of nature. As a result, the moral law, far from giving us a true repetition, still leaves us in generality. This time, the generality is not that of nature, but that of habit as a second nature. It is useless to point to the existence of immoral or bad habits. It is the form of the habit, or as Bergson used to say, the habit of acquiring habits, the whole of obligation, which is essentially moral, or has the form of the good. Furthermore, in this whole or generality of habit, we again find the two major orders, that of resemblance in the variable conformity of the elements of action with a given model insofar as the habit has not been acquired, and that of equivalence with the equality of the elements of action in different situations, once the habit has been acquired. As a result, habit never gives rise to true repetition. Sometimes the action changes and is perfected, while the intention remains constant. Sometimes the action remains the same in different contexts and with different intentions. There again, if repetition is possible, it would appear only between or beneath the two generalities of perfection and integration, testifying to the presence of a quite different power, at the risk of overturning these two generalities. If repetition is possible, it is as much opposed to moral law as it is to natural law. There are two known ways to overturn moral law. One is by ascending towards the principles, challenging the law as secondary, derived, borrowed, or general, denouncing it as involving a second-hand principle, which diverts an original force or usurps an original power. The other way, by contrast, is to overturn the law by descending towards the consequences, to which one submits with a too perfect attention to detail. By adopting the law, a falsely submissive soul manages to evade it, and to taste pleasures it was supposed to forbid. We can see this in demonstration by absurdity, in working to rule, but also in some forms of masochistic behavior which mock by submission. The first way of overturning the law is ironic, where irony appears as an art of principles, of assent towards the principles, and of overturning principles. The second is humor, which is an art of consequences and descents, of suspensions and falls. Must we understand that repetition appears in both this suspense and this assent, as though existence recommenced and reiterated itself? Once it is no longer constrained by laws, repetition belongs to humor and irony. It is by nature transgression or exception, always revealing a singularity opposed to the particulars, subsumed under laws, a universal opposed to the generalities which give rise to laws. There is a force common to Kierkegaard and Nietzsche. They oppose repetition to all forms of generality. Make something new of repetition itself. Connect it with a test, with a selection or selective test. Make it the supreme object of the will and of freedom. Kierkegaard specifies that it is not a matter of drawing something new from repetition, of extracting something new from it. Only contemplation, or the mind which contemplates from without, extracts. It is rather a matter of acting, of making repetition as such a novelty, that is, a freedom and a task of freedom. In the case of Nietzsche, liberate the will from everything which binds it, by making repetition the very object of willing. No doubt it is repetition which already binds, but if we die of repetition, we are also saved and healed by it, healed above all by the other repetition. In consequence, oppose repetition to the laws of nature. Kierkegaard declares that he does not speak at all of repetition in nature, of cycles and seasons, exchanges and equalities. Furthermore, if repetition concerns the most interior element of the will, this is because everything changes around the will in accordance with the law of nature. According to the law of nature, repetition is impossible. For this reason, Kierkegaard condemns as aesthetic repetition every attempt to obtain repetition from the laws of nature by identifying with the legislative principle, whether in the Epicurean or the Stoic manner. It will be said that the situation is not so clear with Nietzsche. Nietzsche's declarations are nevertheless explicit. If he discovers repetition in the physis itself, this is because he discovers in the physis something superior to the reign of laws, a will willing itself through all change, a power opposed to law, an interior of the earth opposed to the laws of its surface. Oppose repetition to moral law to the point where it becomes the suspension of ethics, a thought beyond good and evil. Repetition appears as the logos of the solitary and the singular, the logos of the private thinker. Both Kierkegaard and Nietzsche developed the opposition between the private thinker, the thinker comet, and bearer of repetition, and the public professor and doctor of law, whose second-hand discourse proceeds by mediation and finds its moralizing source in the generality of concepts. As Kierkegaard understands it, repetition is the transcendent correlate shared by psychical intentions of contestation and resignation. Just as irony and black humor are combined in Zarathustra, so there is a within the law and beyond the law, united in the eternal return. Oppose repetition not only to the generalities of habit, but also to the particularities of memory. The psychological movements of memory and habit are of little consequence for both Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. They fade away in the face of repetition, proposed as the double condemnation of habit and memory. In this way, repetition is the thought of the future. It is opposed to both the ancient category of reminiscence and the modern category of habitus. It is in repetition and by repetition that forgetting becomes a positive power, while the unconscious becomes a positive and superior unconscious. For example, forgetting, as a force, is an integral part of lived experience of eternal return. Everything is summed up in power. When Kierkegaard speaks of repetition as the second power of consciousness, second means not a second time, but the infinite which belongs to a single time, the eternity which belongs to an instant, the unconscious which belongs to consciousness, the nth power. And when Nietzsche presents the eternal return as the immediate expression of the will to power does not at all mean to want power, but on the contrary, whatever you will, carry it to the nth power. In other words, separate out the superior form by virtue of the selective operation of thought in the eternal return, by virtue of the singularity of repetition in the eternal return itself. Here, in the superior form of everything that is, we find the immediate identity of the eternal return and the overman. Kierkegaard and Nietzsche invent an incredible equivalent of theater within philosophy, thereby founding simultaneously this theater of the future and a new philosophy.